Hey everybody, Mr. Schultz here. Every time we do a live version of the notes while we're doing distance learning, I will make sure that I try to put together a recording of the same set of notes. That way, if anybody was absent or missed that day or something occurred and you just couldn't get into Canvas or you couldn't get into our Google Meet or whatever, you'll be able to go back and look at it at a later time. Or if you just want to use it to review, you can do that as well. If you've seen the live version, obviously you can go look at the recorded version at the same time. Make sure you didn't miss anything. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to do these pretty quick, and then you can use the office hours, obviously, to kind of come in and ask questions if you have any. So first set of notes was ecosystem dynamics and interactions. Specifically, what we're going to do, let me get a couple things set up here, is we're going to be focusing on Module 1, Lesson 1. Here's a list of all of the standards that we're supposed to be kind of covering through this unit or this section of this unit. I'll let you read through those. I'm not going to read those verbatim, but that's basically kind of our goals, right? Our learning goals. All right, so let's look at the intro to populations and graphing. We need to have a working definition of what ecology is. So ecology is the study of organisms and how they relate to one another and their surroundings. Basically, it's kind of the study of ecosystems. Now, ecosystems have both living and non-living components that make that up. Living components include all the plants or animals or bacteria or fungus or you name it. And then the non-living components are things like air, light, rocks, water. That's the non-living components, okay? There's different categories that are used to organize all the aspects of ecology into different levels. So we'll look at the levels first, and then we'll talk about what are some of the needs that all living things, and then how interdependence, the dependency between organisms, is essential for the health of the ecosystem, okay? So let's look at the levels of organization. The first and simplest level, and we're going from small to large, right, is the organism. So this is the smallest and simplest unit of organization. An individual organism like this zebra that you see in the picture is a single organism, right? A single zebra is one organism. If we look at a group of zebra, right, all the same species, then we're moving up to a different level, and that level is called populations. So that's all the members of a particular species living in the same geographical location. Then we can move up to the community level, which is going to include all these different species. For example, zebras, wildebeest, all the insects that are in a particular area, the bacteria, the different plant life, that can all be considered a community. Now, they have to still be in the same geographical location. And then when we add the non-living components like rocks, water, air, sunlight, that type of stuff, now we're at the ecosystem level. And if we move up to a level bigger than that, then we start getting into the biome level. This is all the ecosystems that basically exist over a large area that have a similar climate. The ecosystem that the zebra would live in, the biome that the zebra would live in would be something like savanna biome. We here in Nevada live in a desert biome. So those are larger areas with a similar climate. And then finally, the largest would be all the biomes on the planet kind of combining, and it forms the biosphere, which is basically all the different biomes of the earth kind of coming together. All right, so that's our levels of organization from very small to very large. Now let's quickly look at some of the basic needs of living things. So another concept that's important to understand in ecology is our what living things need. And we'll focus we're going to focus basically on plants and animals for right now, but keep in mind that these needs are going to be there for bacteria and protists and fungus and you name it. They all have certain needs. Now, some of these needs are similar, some may be a little bit different. So what are the needs of all animals? Well, they need food, they need water, shelter, space, a suitable temperature, as well as mates to reproduce. That's what the species in general, right, would need to survive. If we look at plants, it's a little bit different, not too much, but a little bit different. They still need water. But now instead of needing food, since they can make their own food through the process of photosynthesis, they're going to need light, maybe some minerals from the soil, and then carbon dioxide from the air. They still need space, and then they have to have the ability to reproduce. Now plants, a lot of plants like flowering plants, actually need to have the assistance of certain animals, pollinators like bees and hummingbirds, to help them reproduce, to help them carry pollen. Which brings us to the next concept, the interdependence between plants and animals. So in addition, plants and animals are dependent on one another for certain things. For example, animals need plants for food. So herbivores eat different types of plants, and that's how they get their sustenance, right? Even animals that eat other animals are probably eating an herbivore. So ultimately, all food in an ecosystem comes from these producers, these autotrophs like plants. Plants use carbon dioxide. Well, that happens to be what animals exhale. Okay, and then plants, in turn, during the process of photosynthesis, release oxygen, which happens to be what animals inhale. So there's a gas exchange, right? Carbon dioxide is used by plants, and they produce oxygen, while oxygen is used by animals, and we produce carbon dioxide. Plants need animals, as I mentioned before, to help them with reproduction. Certain flowering plants are going to need pollinators like bees and hummingbirds to help carry pollen from one flower to the other so fertilization can occur. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about interdependence between plants and animals. All right, let's look at some of the roles in an ecosystem. So ecosystem roles are based off of usually feeding levels, and we'll talk about this when we're looking at this pyramid here, and you might have to kind of go back and forth between slides or look at a picture of this on Canvas and then kind of listen to the notes, and it'll maybe make a little bit more sense. But each level contains groups of organisms based on what they eat and how they make energy. So an energy level is interdependent on the other energy levels. So if you take a look at the very bottom, and I'm going to quickly go over this, and then each slide will kind of go over it in a little bit more detail. At the very bottom, you have these heterotrophs, these detritivores that are in the soil, like fungus and earthworms and bacteria, and they help decay or break down dead organic material, plants and animals. The level above that is the plants. They're the autotrophs. They're producing food using photosynthesis. Then you have the level above that is the herbivores, and then you have primary predators, and then secondary predators at the very top. Now, usually at the bottom, you have more organisms, lots of different bacteria and detritivores and plants. And then when you get all the way to the top of the pyramid, it's smaller at the top, and usually at the secondary predator level, you're going to have fewer organisms, at least in a particular ecosystem or area. So let's look at these, and again, I just kind of gave you the quick overview, but we'll talk about each one. The bottom or soil level are the decomposers, the bacteria, the fungi, some invertebrates like worms that break down dead plant and animal tissue. And it helps to cycle nutrients in the ecosystem, which is especially beneficial to plants. The next level up is the green level. These are the producers. The plant life, they use light and carbon dioxide along with water to make their own food. This basically makes them a type of organism called an autotroph, and they're the foundation of life in an ecosystem. They produce all the food for all the other organisms. Even if an organism isn't directly feeding on plants, they're probably feeding on an organism that did feed on plants somewhere down the line. The next level up is the first level consumer. These organisms are herbivores. They typically eat the producers. They're sometimes called primary consumers, and they provide the link of energy from producer to the rest of the organisms in the ecosystem. Then you can move up another level, and you have the carnivores. Some of these are carnivores or omnivores. Omnivores simply means they eat plants and animals, right? They'll eat a little bit of everything. That makes up the next level of the pyramid. These organisms are also called secondary consumers, and they feed on the primary consumers or the primary producers. And then the very top level, this is the level reserved for the top carnivore, the top of the food chain. Sometimes you hear people call it a food chain. These are the fewest in number in an ecosystem, and they can consume organisms from primary producers and both types of consumers. Now, a couple of terminology terms you need to be aware of, and some people kind of mix these up, is habitat and niche. Habitat is where an organism lives. Niche is where it lives, but also the role it plays. So every organism in an ecosystem has a specific role. This role, along with where the organism lives, is called the niche. A niche is different from the habitat because it includes what the organism does in the ecosystems. For example, if you're a producer, right, a plant, then that would be part of your role, right? That's the role you play in the ecosystem. If you're a herbivore that eats the plants, that's another role. Now, you could be living in the same area. Both organisms could have the same habitat, but they play different roles, or they have different niches within that habitat. The habitat includes only where it lives, therefore it's a little bit different than a niche, right? So what the organism eats and who eats it, along with how the organism interacts with the environment and other organisms, are all included in the niche. Rarely will you ever see two species filling the same niche in the same ecosystem at the same time, because there's just too much competition and it's not beneficial for both species. All right, kind of shifting gears now, we're going to move into what population growth is. We'll talk briefly about this, and we're going to go into more detail as we go through lessons 2 and 3 later on in this module. So what is population growth? Population growth can either be positive or negative. In other words, it can be increasing in size. The population could be getting bigger, or it could be decreasing in size. It could be shrinking or getting smaller. So if the population rate is a positive number, that means the population is increasing. This occurs when the simplest way to put it is when the number of births outnumber the number of deaths in a population. When the opposite's true, deaths outnumber births, then it's in decline, or the population is getting smaller, and it will be represented by a negative number. Now, we can't just focus on births and deaths. That's a very simplified view of it. You also have to take into consideration migration. So migration can also impact population size. New organisms can immigrate into a population, or they could emigrate out of the population. Another thing that students typically get mixed up because they sound similar is immigration and emigration. Immigration starts with an I, emigration starts with an E. So one of the ways I usually tell students to try to remember this is immigration is organisms coming in, right? Immigration starts with I, in starts with I. Emigration is organisms leaving a population. Emigration starts with E, and another way of saying leaving would be exiting a population, so they both start with E. So immigration is coming in, emigration is organisms exiting out of a population. Now there's two types of growth that you can see, and that's exponential and logistic. Let's start with exponential, which you see a picture of right here. Exponential growth is when the population continues to grow at a very rapid pace because it is unchecked by any limiting factors. What's a limiting factor? So if we're talking about limiting factors, a limiting factor are things like the amount of food available, the amount of water, the amount of habitat, living space. Those are limiting factors. They can actually slow down and in some cases level off growth. We'll see that when we start talking about logistic growth. Okay, humans are actually currently on this type of growth pattern. Populations are, as far as human terms, are growing exponentially at this time. And I'll probably show you a video this week, Thursday, actually for you guys, Friday, that kind of demonstrates this. It's a pretty cool video that I show every year. It's pretty amazing, and I'll show it to you on Friday. Humans are currently on this type of growth, as I mentioned, so populations can't grow this way forever. Once carrying capacity is reached, and carrying capacity is basically this line that you would see in the graph, and we'll see it on the next graph, that is showing you where the population can reach based on the limiting factors that are available. So once carrying capacity is reached, the population typically levels off. There could even be a little bit of a crash in the population if the numbers get over carrying capacity. It'll kind of drop back down and level off at carrying capacity. So let's take a look at that. There's logistic growth. Logistic growth has got that little dashed red line there that's representing carrying capacity based on the limiting factors that are available. So this is the type of growth that occurs when a population has reached carrying capacity due to one or more of those limiting factors. Sooner or later, all populations will follow a logistic growth pattern. It's just a matter of time before at least one of the limiting factors impacts the population. Examples of limiting factors, as I mentioned before, are food, water, shelter space, mating partners, etc. All right, so what other factors can affect growth? A few things, right? Carrying capacity is what ultimately determines the size of the population. But there's other influences in a population as well. Disease. Disease can spread through a population, especially ones that have high density, and can basically slow down growth, population growth, or even reverse it or make it shrink, right? It can cause a lot more deaths than normal. And if deaths outnumber births, well, then it's a negative growth pattern. Predation. Animals that prey on a population can impact the size. More predators in an area are more likely the prey population will start to decrease because they're feeding on the prey. Competition. As I mentioned before, you usually have very seldom do you have two species that are filling the same niche in the same area because competition is too stiff, right? The resources that are available for the organisms are limited, and members of the population compete to get those resources. This competition can also limit the size of the population. These factors are dependent on several things as well. They're dependent on the proportion, the amount of predators, for example, that impacts the prey. And you're going to see a couple of graphs later on in some of the later lessons that kind of demonstrate this. They show the oscillation of predators and prey populations and how they affect each other. Scale is another thing. The size and the area that the population lives in is a big factor. And then the quantity, the amount of resources that are available, how much food, how much sunlight if it's a plant, how much habitat if it's a certain organism that requires a certain type of habitat, and so on. So how do we graph these? There's two formulas that you got to be aware of. We're not going to go into too much detail on how to do any calculations with them right now. I just kind of want to make you aware of them. The first one, this top one, is population growth formula. It's basically births, subtract the deaths, divide that by the total number in the original population, and that shows the rate that it's growing. Could be a positive number or it could be a negative number. Okay. The formula below is basically looking at the population after a certain number of generations. So this is taking time into a factor, right? So that's the lowercase t. The letters pretty much still mean the same thing, right? The growth rate, how much time's involved, how many generations passed, and then the original number of the population, that capital N. And we'll look more at how to use these and calculate some of these numbers a little bit later. So again, the two graphs that I showed earlier, right? You have two basic graphs. You have the blue one, which is letter A, that's exponential growth. And then the green one, which is letter B, that shows logistic growth. One's kind of J-shaped, right? Letter A is this J-shaped exponential curve, and letter B is this kind of stretched out S-shaped curve that demonstrates logistic growth. All right. That takes us up to the assignment. So Module 1, Lesson 1, make sure you go and do all the self-checks, okay? Do the self-checks. And you can go back and do them more than once. If you get something wrong, you can go back and re-answer it if you wish. Watch all the videos. There's little tabs at the top. Make sure you click the videos. You'll especially need the videos to do the 1.4 assignment, which is down below, okay? This is a Intro to Populations Graphing and Growth Science Notebook. You have to watch 3 videos and then respond to the writing prompts and send that in to me. It's worth 15 points. And then you have another assignment, which is the rabbits, weeds, grass simulation. This is an external link that takes you to a simulation that kind of, you can manipulate some of the different parts of the graph and some of the different parts of the simulation to kind of control it. So you follow the instructions on that and then answer the questions on that as well. All right, so that takes care of the first set of notes. I will try to post this in the next probably couple hours. So thank you, and hopefully you guys will um, have some use of this and it will work out, and we will be able to keep doing these videos, and that way if you miss a day or something like that, you'll be able to get the notes, and if you miss the live version, you can get the recorded version. Okay. All right, guys, have a great night.